Welcome to another episode of Let's Not Circle Back. We are following up on our last episode on human-centered AI by exploring how AI could help keep our history alive. So Halloween is right around the corner. Now, what if I told you the story of witches had nothing to do with broomsticks and spells and everything to do with beer? Today, I'm joined by Dr. Patrice Palmer, and we're going to dive into the forgotten origins of words and work, the kind of work that history has rewrote and AI might be rewriting again. From alewives and cauldrons to coders in classrooms, we're exploring how women have brewed, built, and unfortunately been erased, one generation and one word at a time. But let's start where it all began, with the brew. Dr. Palmer, you once told me you stumbled onto a story that completely changed how you see witches and beer. Talk to us about that connection.
Yeah, so the funny part is that I had no idea that this was ever a thing until I got into craft beer. The whole craft piece should have actually warned me that this is something. One of the things that I learned is kind of a part of the myth of where witches come from. So I can't definitively say that this is exactly where they got it from. However, the similarities cannot be ignored. When you picture a witch, what do you see? So you look at the pointy hat, you look at the cauldron, you look at the black cat, and all of this mysterious brew that changes a man's perception and changes how you're able to interact. But how do these images actually go together? Is it just magic? When we talk about it in the brewing industry, we recognize that the origins of brewing really date back thousands of years, and it often centers around women. And women being the first brewers. It doesn't matter if you're in medieval England, if you're in the Andes in South America, if you're in South Africa, on the continent of Africa, women have been the workers in that space. They were referred to often as brewsters or alewives, and they often had tall hats because they were in a marketplace, so they needed to be seen. And they carried around cats who made sure that the grain that they also brought while they were brewing wasn't eaten up. So you needed to make sure you had a cat around to stop the rats who would eat up the grains. And they had this cauldron that they were putting all these ingredients in, and it was bubbling, it was moving, it was alive. And then they created this potion that magically changed over time your disposition. And so you can see how these things begin to cast the idea, the superstition, the magic around brewing and witches. And so what we also see in that conversation is that how women were the backbone of that industry and who really took care of their families based on that, but then got muscled out some kind of way through the institutionalization of the actual craft. And when people wanted to sell it, women got pushed to the back burner, and in some ways were even demonized for working because now they find value in it. When it was women and women's work, they did not find the value. But now that you're making money, now that there is an industry that's building around and you have a consumer base, you have brand reputation, loyalty, now somebody wants to walk in and say, hey, you can't do this, let us step in. And that is really how beer began to separate from what women produced and what they built into something now that is this superstitious, ugly, scary, magical understanding of an industry that was really created from the foundations by women brewers, brewsters, alewives, and how women's work. Again, going back to the conversation around how data is sometimes suppressed and compressed in ways that it takes the history from. We see that in beer, and we see that with the story of the witch also. So I know you have talked about in the past kind of patterns that show up in other industries, or there are other ways. I know beer, but I know there are other things, that same kind of playbook has played out for women
Absolutely.
particularly.
And I did fact check you, Patrice, and according to ChatGPT and Claude both, that is a true story, that is how beer came out. So we can use AI to fact check as well. And you're right, the way it was described to me was this pattern that where it's originally women's work, but then it turns into men's professions. And so we've seen this happen in addition to craft brewing is whenever women dominate a field, it's often devalued. It's considered women's work. But when men enter, it becomes professionalized and pay comes along with it. And so one example, in my college years back in the 80s, I was data processing, which was kind of the original coding. And when the first programmers were actually all women, it was 1943, around 1943, 1945, this electronic numerical integrator came about, and they hired these women, Jean, Betty, Kathleen, Marilyn, Frances, Ruth, all women, and they were actually hired as computers. So they were human clerks who solved equations. And when they actually went to go build this computer, they actually trained these women to program it. There was no programming manual, and they literally invented programming techniques. So they invented things like subroutines and breakpoints. But for decades, their work was minimalized. It was written off as clerical. It was actually, I was in the clerical staff when I was doing data entry and writing small code. But then as programming became more prestigious in the 1960s and 1970s, then kind of, as you said, the women were nudged out, and they were nudged out at the leadership levels. They were kept at the entry level. And then it was rebranded as this high prestige after the war. And often now, high dollars. A lot of the computer programmers are paid a lot of money. And we've seen it in a couple of other areas like medicine and education. When you think about women were the original midwives and healers. And as the universities came about and we transitioned doctors into more education around being a doctor, and more lucrative, then you started to see the men became the doctors and the women became what they called midwives or nursing. And they were, again, devalued, but essential. And in education, teaching children was always considered natural women's work, right? And it was low paid, still is low paid. But then as we started to get to the universities and higher education, the professors and administrators were men. They were higher status and higher pay. So I do think we've seen now this pattern, even going back hundreds of years, that when women are doing the work, it's devalued. When men are doing the work, it's considered professional and the dollars come with it.
Absolutely. And I also thought about the movie Hidden Figures, right? Where these black women were literally sending people to space and their entire story was completely forgotten. Doulas, we see that now as a profession that really started out of women who were midwives. A lot of those women were black women, indigenous women who came with their own healing techniques and they worked. It's not like there were just these things that were just out there in kind of pseudoscience. That it worked and it was passed down. It was a historical thing that was brought into play. And even now, some of the things that we do in science and in education are absolutely connected to women who pass down all of these different intricate and even more intentional ways of how to support and heal and empathize with people. With AI, we have this absolutely new opportunity to write these people back into history, to give them back what they so rightfully deserve, to give them their voices back. And to give them their professions back, something that they actually started. So, as we're talking about this, and I know we're bringing this into the kind of the holiday season, I really want folks to think about what they're doing around the data that they're collecting and how they are being inclusive of people because it is so easy to rewrite history right now and hopefully write it in the right way so that these voices, these communities, these women specifically are left again to memory.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we are often asked to do is come in and do nomenclature workshops, right? Because words do matter. We've seen that in this particular climate, even more so now, words matter. And this new generation's coming in and they're questioning, appropriately questioning. I think some people get very upset about that. They're like, why does it matter? Are you telling me I can't use this word anymore? Or it's like, no, but we just had a history of questioning language. We always have, right? Words come and go. But now it seems like it's becoming more sensitive when we're saying, hey, what's this word? The couple of examples I have is like paddy wagon. I had no idea that came from, let's throw all the Irishmen in jail. And now you think about it and you go, well, that makes sense, right? Why else would something be called a paddy wagon? And we were looking up other ones like deadline. You think about that, like I've got a deadline at work. And where did that word actually come from? Because it seems like such a weird word to use. And then when you look at the origin of it, it was actually the lines before they had gates at a prison. There were lines drawn around the prison. And if you passed that line as a prisoner, the guards would shoot you dead. And so it was the deadline. And so now are we asking you not to use the word deadline? No, we're not, right? And that's often what people think when we say, like, be more inclusive and think about your words, that we're giving you this list of words you can't use. And I honestly wish it was that easy, but it's just saying, right, I would take that list and say, yes, let's stop. It's not that easy, right? But it is saying when we get challenged on words, we need to stop and stop getting so upset about it, right? Because we've done it for years. We've used, even our parents were using groovy and things like that. We don't use that anymore. There's so many words we just don't use, and they've come out of our language. But I think for some reason now, though, Patrice, it's like it is so highly sensitive whenever you challenge a word or whenever you challenge a history, even though it's just, hey, we shouldn't forget this. Especially, you're right, with AI, we have this opportunity that we've never had before to actually capture our history so that the next generation doesn't have to go read about it in books. It's kind of in there if anyone wants to know.
Absolutely. And I think, again, you bring up something so clear is that the sensitivity around words, it is something that has kind of evolved as our society is learning more. But that's the whole point of growth. It's to make you uncomfortable so that you can take in more information. And so I think folks have taken on kind of this understanding now that if you tell me no, and you don't replace it, what do we do now? And so I think as you're going into AI and we're talking about different identities, different ethnic groups, different ways of talking about a term, these are things that you need to be making sure are already written into so that one, AI who is not creating these new thoughts, but is it generating based on the information that it has, can accurately capture the communities to which you want to support or just to be able to name. That's the reasoning. That's why we want you to be thinking about this, not to do away with it, but to know that some of these words are archaic and there's no need for them to be in the sequence anymore. We've outgrown them and there are new words. And guess what? I mean, Pam, you just had a new grandbaby come in. She's coming in with a whole new set of words that we haven't even thought of to replace the words that we've always done it this way. That's life, that's growth, that's human. And I want folks to recognize that.
Oh, yeah. And sometimes we have to laugh at it and not get upset. Like Patrice, as you know, my family absolutely loves board games. And so one of the board games that we purchased a few years ago, actually during COVID, was a game called Mind the Gap. And it's like Trivial Pursuit. You have to understand trivia, but if you don't have someone on your team from every generation, then it's really hard for you to win. And so it's really great to have grandparents on there, young kids, your millennials, your Zs, your forgotten generation. And one of the words that came up, and my son was on the team with me, and the card said, what's a word that means to throw something? And we had context that said it was part of Gen Z. And all of a sudden he just spits out yeet. And I was like, that is such a made up word. That can't be it. And then you and your team have to actually discuss whether that's the word to win the point. And we were also like pushing back, like, these are adults that wrote this game. And that clearly is not a word. And you're overthinking it. And sure enough, you turn it over and it's yeet. And I'm like, there's no way in heck that's an actual word. But but we're dealing with it with humor, right? We're talking about it like, why do you need a new word for that? And it's curious and it's humor. And I do think that as much as possible when we talk about nomenclature and words and changing vocabulary, that when we can, we talk about it in a humorous way. Things are evolving and changing, just like we did when people hear somebody use the word groovy, we go, "Wow, okay, I haven't heard that word in a while." But nobody gets mad. We don't. We think it's funny that we somebody used that in their day. And so I do think as we look to how do we actually bring civility back in the workplace, there has to be that some level of humor. Also, back when women were coding and sending people to the moon, why was that? And literally called Hidden Figures. Why did we not respect it then? And now it's such a respected profession. And when someone says that they went to school and they're a coder, everybody's, "Ooh, you must be really smart." Right? And that's the initial reaction, is you must be very smart. So our language has actually defined what we respect and how we think about certain professions.
Absolutely. I mean, we do that now. Working in higher ed, students who are in the business college, when they say that they're business, there is a respect that comes with that, right? People are, okay, I know what you basically are going to be doing. You're going to be able to take care of yourself. Awesome. I know why you're getting this degree. My major was sociology. I am not a sociologist right now, but that was my major, right? So when I told my mother I wanted to be a sociologist, she literally was like, "What is that? That's not a real thing." And I'm like, "No, like that's how we understand how cultures connect to each other and why they do what they do. And it builds on the social sciences." And she was very much like, "That's not a real thing. Go get a real job." And it's because it didn't have a respect to it, right? And people ask you that. We have students going home for fall break and for winter break. Your family's going to ask you, "What's your major?" So I think that that's something, if we are assigning respect to it, what do we think that the data is going to do? Also, like there's a respect that has to be assigned to it to make sure that it is a value. There's a valuation that has to be on what we're putting in. Words are not just these arbitrary things. And I think something else that you said that really stood out to me was when you said yeet. Now you can hear it. I'm pretty sure if we go into the people still have dictionaries, right? There's a thesaurus somewhere, or at least a pop culture one at the very least that has that word in it. But like now that you know what you're listening for, you hear it more often. And that's a human thing. Like now that we can categorize that in our brains, we know what we're talking about. We now can see it, we can hear it, and we know the context to which it's supposed to be in. That's what our programs are doing. That's what generative AI is doing. Once you are saying this thing, it then is categorizing and aligning it to what you need. So, very similarly, when we were using sensory data just to go and turn on a faucet in a restroom, the original code did not account for the darkness in my hand. So literally, I would have soap, hopefully, if it worked, and I couldn't wash my hands because it was not trained on anyone who had a darker palm. And therefore, I cannot really utilize something that is supposed to be a time saver, that's supposed to be accessible for everyone, but because the program was not trained to see me, and now I can't even be a part of things. So I love that you brought that into this space of like, once you hear it and you see it, now you can be aware that can be written in and that can be there to support that population, because that is what AI is supposed to do. At the core, it is an accessible tool. It's made for everyone if it is made with everyone in mind. And again, it goes to one of my favorite quotes. It's one thing to say all are welcome. It's quite another to say I created this with you in mind. AI can be created with you in mind, but it takes us as humans to do that.
No, and I love that quote too. It's such a difference, right? And
Yeah.
and it's such a quick quote that people get it right when you say
Mhm.
it. They're like, "Oh, what a difference!" Right? And and when you think about why this is important, people might say, Pam and Patrice, you've been doing diversity, equity, inclusion, and culture work for a long time. And why is this even more important now? And it's because we do believe that words matter. And we are taking a change management approach to this work, which means we're not trying to just shove something down someone's throat, whether it's right or not. So we don't really care about the words. And if there's words or phrases that are derailers for anything, trying to accomplish whatever we're trying to accomplish, then we say, what are the words that are actually going to drive progress? And so I think that that's how this all fits together when you think about nomenclature and words. And people get so upset when you say, well, let's think about whether we should use this phrase or this word going forward. Because people are just holding on tight to these. And it doesn't really, I don't really understand why, because most people, they don't even ever say these words. But the minute you try to say, let's avoid using these because here's actually the historical context behind it, and it's a derailer for a lot of people when we use this word, they get super upset and frustrated. So I want to take the emotion out of it somewhat too. And again, if we can make a little light of it and bring some humor to it, often that's helpful. But I do want to, we do want to acknowledge that sometimes we do need to challenge words. And we've seen some of them, like, I think I mentioned this on an earlier show, when we look at open the kimono. That was a very common term in the finance world to say open the books. And then as this next generation came about and started challenging, I don't understand what you mean by that. Why would you open someone's dress or look under someone's dress? And then they would have these debates with me, about, well, Pam, if we take away the kimono, like it's so everything has to be so politically correct and culturally appropriate. I said, take out the kimono and just say, let's look under someone's dress. Would you actually ever say that? Right. And so we want people to think about it, but not every day. This is not something we want you to go thinking about your entire language. But in moments where you're challenged, sit back and say, let me hear you out, as opposed to just dismissing and saying, you are trying to take away all these words that, I grew up with. And I think we've also talked to the younger generation too, to say, I shouldn't have laughed at my son when he knew the word yeet, but I certainly didn't get mad. Like, why are you making up a new word? It was humorous. And I would ask that the younger generation finds some humor too, when appropriate, to some of the words and the phrases. And they're like, Mom, why would anybody ever want to open someone's dress? Saying, look in the kimono. And there's such a way to handle it to where you're not saying, wow, you're so stupid, or you're so mean or ignorant. But it was just, I have no idea why that phrase came up. I certainly didn't start the phrase, and it doesn't make any sense. And you're starting to see that phrase naturally come out of the workplace. But still, when it does come up, I witnessed these earlier in career folks just hitting that person hard with, why did you say that? That's so awful. So I think we all need to take some of this when we can, with a bit of humor when appropriate, but also it's happened so many times. Language evolves. And so if whenever you're challenged on words, maybe you think about the witch's story and you come back to it and you say, you know what, I things change and perspectives. And now I'm going to look at a witch this Halloween a little bit different than I did before I heard your story.
Absolutely. I mean, definitely don't forget to provide a toast to the witches that you see, hear, or interact with in some way. But again, I'm in agreement that sometimes how folks approach the conversation is really what can derail it. This brings me back to a quote by Brother Malik Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, that there was once upon a time that you didn't know what you knew. And so we have to meet people with that type of grace when we are introducing new topics, new opportunities, new ways of thinking. That there was a time that you weren't as learned, that you didn't understand, that you were not in this place of healing, that you could take in this information. Remember that so that you can be able to give that to someone else. And it's not necessarily just what that person said, but it's also the approach that happens after. And again, I think you said it best. It's not excusing bad behavior. It's not dismissing things that are absolutely problematic and toxic in the space, but it's approaching it with curiosity. It's involving humor, love, compassion, however that supports you and how you can take in information. But most importantly, it's the human piece of it. And what I think we're trying to do is to remind folks about that before they inject it into this inanimate object that will then be speaking to humans. Remember that humans are at the center of this work. And no matter what the story is, we have the beauty of understanding it, having it a part of our society, a part of our culture. But this inanimate object does not know, and it's not going to be able to pull that understanding without you. So the data that you put in must be data that is supported by the communities to which it's going to serve. And so I think those are just things to not forget, and if necessary, drink a beer before you do it. Hopefully that'll tee up some better conversation.